I'm David Van Slyke. I'm the Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and I want to welcome all the Maxwell and SU alumni and to the members of the public who are joining us here this evening. I'm delighted that so many of you could join us tonight. This remarkable crowd is a reflection of the unparalleled Maxwell network of more than 3,500 alumni in the greater DC area. And it's my special pleasure to host this event along with our Maxwell Advisory Board that's here with us tonight, and to share with you some of the important work going on at the Maxwell School. First, let me acknowledge I'm honored to welcome and recognize many current and former members of the Maxwell Advisory Board who have joined us here tonight. Also joining us this evening are Maxwell graduates Gene and Dick Thompson. Both are dedicated volunteers and supporters of Maxwell and the university, and Dick is Chair Emeritus of the Syracuse University Board of Trustees. I'd really appreciate it if board members, both past and present, and Gene and Dick Thompson, can I ask you all to please stand and be recognized?
I keep thinking this is magical instead of Maxwell. Listen.
These volunteers help Maxwell in many important ways, meeting with and advising our students, our faculty, our leadership team, and myself on important issues that inform our recruitment, our strategy, and our programming. They give tirelessly and enthusiastically to ensure that Maxwell remains the remarkable school that it is. As many of you know, there is no other school like Maxwell in the country. Actually, no other place like Maxwell in the world. We were founded as a school focused on citizenship education. We have a top-ranked public administration program, all within a dynamic school of social sciences, which provides strength and a framework for all that we do. And our students, faculty, staff, and alumni are collectively dedicated to the theme of the Athenian Oath, to transmit the city greater, beautiful, and better than it was transmitted to us. The oath serves not only as our unofficial creed, but it's core to our values and all that we strive to achieve. As a faculty member myself for the past 13 years, and as dean for the past 10 months, I've seen, participated, and benefited from this philosophy firsthand. I think we can all agree that regardless of one's political affiliation, there's never been a more important time to be working with, working for, or attending the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. The chasm that separates us will only subside when we take an active citizenship role focused on engagement, dialogue, respect, and understanding. And tonight's program is very much aligned with these goals. There's so much for me to tell you about what's happening at the school, but I'm going to limit myself to just a few more comments. Later this summer, the Maxwell School will launch our first online degree program, an Executive Master's in Public Administration. This program was designed and will be taught by the same Maxwell faculty who teach in our top-ranked MPA program. This 30-credit Maxwell degree can be completed entirely online and in as little as 15 months. There are materials explaining the program at the back of the check-in table, and I'd encourage you to consider it yourself if you've not yet done a graduate degree, to recommend those who work for you or those you know to consider the material. I think it's a very exciting opportunity, and it'll provide a Maxwell experience to students across the country and around the world. Some of you may not know how much Maxwell has changed in the years since you've been there. Today we have nearly 3,000 students, 2,000 of them at the undergraduate level, and nearly 1,000 graduate students across all our programs. And yes, all our undergraduate social science alumni are indeed forever Maxwell alumni themselves. You're a very important part of our history and our future. Maxwell students, both graduate and undergraduate, continue to be the very best. And I just want to tell you about some of the awards that our students have won this year. For example, 16 of the 35 Remembrance Scholars this year at Syracuse University are Maxwell students, and 4 of the 12 University Scholars come directly out of Maxwell. There's also some things you should know about some new programmatic initiatives that we've undertaken. We have a new Citizenship and Civic Engagement undergraduate major. It's an interdisciplinary program that's easy to double major with, and we've just had our first graduating class. It's closely aligned with our groundbreaking Maxwell courses, which some of you may remember from the time that you were there. A curriculum which explores both domestic and international issues of citizenship, ethics, and justice while applying the tools of the social sciences. We expect that the Citizenship and Civic Engagement program will continue to put us on a path of growth and success in the years to come. I'm also pleased to tell you that this year we hired 12 new faculty members across all of our disciplines who will join us later this summer. They're dynamic leaders in their respective fields and will no doubt work hard in the years ahead to honor the Maxwell tradition of great teachers actively engaged in scholarship who are doing policy-relevant work. Some of you may remember courses that you had with legendary professors like Michael Sawyer, Bob McClure, Ralph Ketchum, Astrid Merget, Bill Copeland, David Bennett, and many others. Of our current 160 faculty members, they continue to garner both national and international attention, and they've won many top university and national awards. I'll give you just a small sampling, and some of the names may be familiar to you for faculty that you've had. Earlier this year, Professor Pete Wilcoxon from the Department of Public Administration and International Affairs was selected as the Leslie Whittington Excellence in Teaching recipient by the National Association of Schools of Public Administration. This year, Professor Jackie Orr of Sociology will receive a Syracuse University Meredith Teaching Professorship. Professor Jeff Gonda of History and Janelle Robinson from Geography will receive Meredith Teaching Awards. Professor Peg Herman from Political Science will receive the Wasserstrom Prize for Outstanding Graduate Teaching, and Jennifer Carras-Montes from Sociology will receive the Chancellor's Citation for Excellence. I believe that the quality of teaching at Maxwell is as strong as it's ever been. Now I want to tell you about a few changes in the Dean's office. First of all, Dr. Carol Faulkner, who's a professor of history and former chair of the History Department, is our new Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and Dr. Andrew London, professor of sociology and former chair of the Department of Sociology, is our new Associate Dean for Finance and Administration. They have both hit the ground running, are off to a great start, and I'm deeply grateful for all that they've stepped up in the important work and demanding roles that they're in. I'd be remiss if I did not thank Associate Dean Scott Barrett and his entire team for their hard work in putting this alumni event together. Thanks go to Linda Birnbaum, Norma Shannon, Jessica Murray, Kathleen Fenney, Jessica Smith, Jennifer Conjal, Gretchen Fitzgerald, and Dana Cook. And I'd also like to thank from the Dean's office Bethany Wallawender and Sarah McLaughlin for their assistance, and from our DC office here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Ryan Williams and Samantha Clemens. Now it's my honor to introduce the moderator of this evening's event, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, Dr. Grant Rear. Many of you know that in addition to being a talented teacher, Grant is also the creator, the host, and the producer of the Campbell Conversations. This is an award-winning weekly regional NPR public affairs show, and Grant has interviewed many different guests, from political activists to elected officials to writers, and few people I know are as knowledgeable of or as thoughtful and passionate about public service and citizenship than our own distinguished colleague, Grant Rear. So now it's my honor to introduce him to you, and I look forward to him leading this event. Grant?
Thank you, Dave. Thanks. Speaking of the radio program, one of the really wonderful recent interviews that I had was this gentleman sitting right here, Len Berman. And one of the things that Dave did not mention was the way that, and I could say this having been at the Maxwell School for 25 years, it's really remarkable to see the way that Dave has poured his heart and soul into this job in the short time that he's had it. So I want to thank Dave on behalf of the Maxwell School. Now, we've had a couple forums on campus on the Trump presidency so far, earlier on than we are now. And at one of those that I had the privilege to moderate, I had remarked that regardless of what you think about the Trump presidency so far. It has provided a lot of material to work with.
That is true.
That is something that hasn't changed, I think, in the intervening weeks. And in many ways, I think it's hard to believe that we're only 90 days into it for all of the things that we've seen. Now, I have to tell you that that group back on campus was a faculty group, was in pretty heated agreement about those early days. And we wanted to do something a little different here, where we could hear and participate in something in which different views would be able to engage each other. And to that end, then we've got two folks from leading think tanks that usually wear somewhat different uniforms when it comes to policy analysis and advocacy. They have nicely overlapping areas of expertise, but the assumption is that they're not likely to see these first 90 days through the same lens, but we'll find out soon about that. And we're very grateful for them for taking the time to be with us this evening. I'll introduce them briefly. First, Heidi Schierholz is Senior Economist and Director of Policy at the Economic Policy Institute and leads the Institute's Perkins Project on worker rights and wages, which is focused on Trump administration policies. In addition to being an economist at the Institute, Heidi also served in the Obama administration as chief economist at the Department of Labor. And there she worked on projects related to workers' rights and wages and benefits. Now, she also tends bees. And that leads, I think, in a philosophical way of sorts, if you think of Mandeville's fable, to Ryan Streeter, who is our other speaker. Ryan is Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to that, he was the Executive Director of the Center for Politics and Governance at the University of Texas. His past public service includes Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy for then Indiana Governor Mike Pence and Special Assistant for Domestic Policy in the George W. Bush White House. Both Ryan and Heidi have written widely, and they're very active presences in the national media. Now, Heidi and Ryan, as I pondered how to go about giving you the best vehicle to discuss the first 90 days, I thought it might work better to put to you some very general, abstract questions versus choosing on my own specific policy issues or particular executive actions in order to let you pick the substantive areas that you want to discuss and to frame those. So that's what I'm going to do. And if there are topics that are important to folks here that do not get treated in the conversation that we're about to have, then they can be addressed through the audience Q&A that we're going to have after we have our conversation up here. In each instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a question to one of the two of you and then ask for a relatively brief response, if you can, so we can fit a few in. Something like, say, 3 minutes or so, give or take. And then I'll ask the other one to react to what they just heard, and then we'll see from there if there is a need for further discussion between the two of you. And we'll move along like that for a few questions, and after about 45 minutes or so, we'll see what you folks want to pose to these two. And when we get to that point, we do have a microphone or more than one microphone that will be going around, and we ask that you wait. Raise your hand and I'll recognize you. We ask that you wait for the microphone. We'll all be able to hear you, but we are making a video archive of this, and so we want you to be part of that as well. So I'm going to sit down now, and Heidi, I want to start with you. In terms of a change in policy direction from where we stood at the end of 2016, so take that as the baseline. In terms of a change in policy direction from that, what would you regard as the one or two initiatives taken by this new administration that concern you the most, and why?
That's a good question. There's a lot to choose from that concerns me right now. But I'll say the first thing that jumped into my mind. One of the things that is still on. One of a really important rule that was put through the Department of Labor under the Obama administration has the wonkiest name in the world, the fiduciary rule, but it has this impact that is so unbelievably important and resonant and easy to understand. And what it does essentially is it requires that your financial advisor act in your best interest. That's it. That is already required of your lawyer. That is already required of your doctor. But there are big loopholes that meant in many cases that was actually not required of your financial advisor. So financial advisors, in many cases, were able to legally steer clients towards investments that would give them a kickback and give lower returns to the client. The sort of estimates of the costs of this are on the order of conflicted advice, they call it conflicted advice. Conflicted advice causing retirement savers on the order of $17 billion a year. So this was just a really big loophole that needs to be closed. It's particularly important in this era where we have a real retirement crisis looming. We have people that are reaching retirement age without enough savings. We need to do what we can to boost that and protect the people who do have retirement savings, to protect that. So that's what the fiduciary rule is doing. There is a pretty bald-faced attempt to weaken that rule by the Trump administration. They have now delayed the rule. There was an executive order that was put in place saying the Labor Department needs to examine the rule. And the Labor Department, in order to do that examination, has delayed the implementation of the rule for 60 days. It is very likely that as a result of that examination of the rule, the administration will then ask them to propose another rule that will be weakened. The word on the street is it probably will not be entirely rescinded, but there will be a weaker rule. So I think, it's a really sort of one of the themes that action by the Trump administration sort of hits on is he really did, as a candidate, spend a lot of time talking about how he was sort of with regular people and standing by regular folks, and this is just a case of that's not what's happening. It really is standing by unscrupulous members of the financial, and I'm not saying all members of the financial industry are unscrupulous, but it's the ones who their business model depends on fleecing retirement advisors who are the ones who benefit from this rule. So weakening that rule kind of shows who it shows who you're kind of siding with in policy. I'll stop babbling now.
So, Ryan, I don't know if you want to comment on that particular rule, but certainly the more general point that Heidi was suggesting is that there's a disconnect between, in terms of economic status, the appeal of candidate Trump and the policies of President Trump. I don't know if that's a bigger question that you'd prefer addressing, but.
Yeah, well, I think it's appropriate to kind of characterize the action that Heidi was just describing against the backdrop of this overall attempt in the early days to do something in the category of regulatory reform, getting regulations off the books. This is something that he did actually talk about on the campaign, and which they've tried to focus on. They've used this little-known law called the Congressional Review Act as a way to get some of these regulations off the books. It's a law that's been around since '96, hardly used at all, but allows Congress to repeal rules at the federal level that within 60 days of them having been reported. In a number of cases, there are rules on the books that never were reported to Congress, and so they're using this as an opportunity to do that, to show that they're on the side of whatever, of business and so forth. I think that activity, actually, if I had to give one sort of comment about just media attention to and just public attention to the first 100 days of this administration, I think that's where some of the interesting work has been done, is in what they're doing with regulations, what they've been doing with these executive orders, what they're trying to achieve. There's a lot you can't do with executive orders. There's a lot of fanfare with executive orders. Anyone who's ever been responsible for implementing an executive order at a federal agency will know it's very easy to slow walk them or implement them in a way that's very minimalistic. But that's if you kind of could do a read through sort of the catalog of those regulations, it gives you a sense of kind of where their heads have been. But yeah, I think that the first 100 days, which we all spend a lot of time worrying about. I'm not sure how much at the end of the day the first 100 days actually really matters. Presidents do sometimes do spectacularly successful or miserable things after the first 100 days. But I think in these first 100 days, what my general observation of this administration has been just kind of either an inability or an unwillingness to kind of answer the question, where exactly are we going? You know, so if you look at healthcare reform, that what was attempted there, if you look at tax reform, sort of what victory looks like, what the end goal is, that's the thing that I think has been a little bit hard to describe. Maybe it, you know, helps explain some of the disorder. You know, every administration has some disorder in the early days, but in this particular case, I tie it to that. So even when it comes to these particular rules that they're pulling off the books and executive orders, it's a little bit hard to understand exactly what the end goal is. On some of the regulations, as they've talked about it, it's to take, you know, needless burdens off of businesses. But in terms of being able to explain publicly what they're doing, I think that's where this administration could do some work. I mean, if you think about, you know, in the early days of the Bush administration after the 2000 election, you know, they had a book. I mean, you could see it on a coffee table with a bunch of policy proposals, speeches by candidate Bush, fact sheets. You could check the data. You kind of, and it was no surprise that then Bush was focused on No Child Left Behind and focused on health savings accounts and these things that were actually in the book. It's like, we said this is what we're going to do. This is why. This is what we're doing. Similarly, at the beginning of the Obama administration, President Obama, it was very different circumstances. The economy was cratering, and so propping up the economy and what we were going to do about that was very much the focus of the administration. Very clear decision early on to focus on healthcare reform, even against the you know, advice of some of his advisors. They came out and did that. They explained what the goal was. The American public kind of knew where they were going. And I think, you know, right now, in terms of where we're actually going with these policies and what winning looks like, we're going to have a lot of winning, but with respect to the final kind of healthcare, what it looks like to win on healthcare. Actually, on that one, he was probably more clear in a State of the Union than I thought he was going to be. He actually kind of gave 5 principles that they would follow. But when it comes to even like a successful tax overhaul, it's not entirely clear what winning looks like.
So a couple things I want to ask that came out of that. I wanted to ask them later, but you've brought them up. But first, Heidi, do you want to respond to anything that Ryan has said, one way or another?
I am happy to.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the
briefly, and then we'll go on.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So one of this question of I talked about the fiduciary rule and this sort of broader agenda. One thing that does seem to be clear, and you're right, President Trump talked about this a lot on the campaign trail too, is just deregulation. And you can actually see just the systematic dismantling of laws and regulations, in particular many laws and regulations. The ones I'm focused on, so not in particular, but the ones that I look at a lot, are the regulations that protect worker rights and wages. And you can just sort of see down the road. So there's and more along this theme of kind of saying one thing about supporting workers and doing another thing. There's one law that was blocked. President Trump signed, it went through this Congressional Review Act mechanism. Congress blocked the rule, and it was signed by President Trump to block the rule, was this rule related to procurement called Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces Rule. What that rule does is, sort of to back up a second, we spend billions of dollars every year in this country to federal contractors to provide goods and services. Everything from big defense contracts to concessions at national parks. So we put a lot of money into this. There is currently no mechanism in place to ensure that we are not providing new contracts to contractors who have a history of violating, say, safety laws, who have a history of violating wage laws. There's nothing that lets us check into that history when people are vying for new contracts. This Fair Pay Safe Workplaces rule would have done exactly that. It would have said people who are vying for new contracts have to disclose if they have a history of violating the very laws of the government that they are now trying to contract with. And they would have, there were mechanisms in place that they could be very clear if their violations, if they'd fixed things, if they sort of taking care of the situation. But the agencies who were awarding the contracts would be allowed to take any history of violations into account when awarding new contracts. So that not being able to do that rewards bad actors. So it actually hurts high road businesses who don't want to cut corners in safety and don't want to cut corners in not paying wages people are owed. And so it hurts non-bad actor employers, and it of course hurts workers who then have to have less safe working conditions, and they may suffer from wage theft or being required to work overtime hours and not get overtime pay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this action related to procurement was extremely anti-worker and very, very quiet. It just went through, there was no fanfare when President Trump signed this. But at the same, this just happened a couple of days ago, he signed an executive order that was Buy American. And to a lot of fanfare, a lot of publicity that came out. And so it's sort of also, and I'm hooking those together in my mind because it's also related to procurement, because Buy American provisions are about, I don't actually really know that much about our Buy American provisions, but they're about how there's provisions in our Buy American provisions in our procurement standards. And so what that EO that got a lot of fanfare, a lot of we are supporting American jobs, it's really weak tea. It doesn't actually do anything. The thing that it does is it says we are going to review these Buy America provisions. So that got a lot of press and activity and discussions about how this administration is standing up for American workers and American jobs. Well, in this exact same context, procurement context, they're just doing this other action that is really immediate effects on making workplaces less safe, less fair for workers. So I don't actually know how I started this, but it was just to go in. Yeah, I'll just.
Well, let me jump in, and you mentioned Ryan, I think, and you both mentioned executive orders. I want to come back to that and frame that in a bit of a broader question about how you perceive the impact of the administration on the way government works. But Ryan, let me come back to you. And again, it's a simplistic kind of question, but you mentioned winning, and what does winning look like? All right.
I didn't come up with the phrase.
What would you? But what would you regard as so far anyway? What would you regard as the two biggest wins so far of this administration? What's the two best successes so far? However you want to define it.
Yeah, it's a pretty short list for the first 100 days, and actually, like I said earlier, I think we can expect a little bit too much out of the first 100 days. So. I don't think there's a lot to point at. I think probably in terms of some general goals of this administration, probably more just on the foreign policy front, where we've seen reversals in the president's stance, that there's been a kind of a decisive break from the previous administration on how we send signals to bad actors around the world. I mean, I think people are surprised now at how he's treating Russia, the stance towards what he did in Syria with the Tomahawks, and then followed up with the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan against ISIS. These are all things that he said he was going to be tough on the campaign. And again, these actions in the short term they actually gained. He got praise from people that don't normally praise him for these actions in the foreign policy community, and he did an about face, for instance on Syria. And so again. These actions are against the backdrop of a kind of foreign policy objectives that haven't been super clearly articulated. And so again, that's another one of these directional issues that in the short term they score some wins in the sense of increasing America's credibility in the world, or people paying attention to us who thought that they didn't have to over the last couple of years. But I think that we again don't know what victory looks like. What kicking what out of ISIS actually what that means. Is it total eradication? Is it what's the overall strategy? What's the soft power strategy? These are really just things that we haven't heard from the administration. So if those individual actions gained some progress in their minds in the early days, lacking a coherent strategy going forward will be a problem. And so I think when it comes to the legislative front, there's really at this point not a lot to point to, because the big ticket items that they've been talking about are still unresolved.
I want to jump in on that. So both of you, how important was the failure of the healthcare reform effort. I mean, how significant do you think that failing was?
Well, it was significant for sure, and I think that the decision that they made was, and I'm not saying I have inside knowledge of this, just as an observer, was kind of a leading from behind decision to allow primarily the congressional Republicans, primarily the House, to design this particular bill and this package, and then to work behind closed doors to send signals. And so I think, again, you had sort of ceding that authority to the members of Congress, particularly to the House. And I think probably this administration wasn't fully appreciating the divisions that actually exist within the House.
Who knew? Who knew?
Yeah, and so again, probably in retrospect, it could have gone better if you'd had a clearer and more aggressive sort of set of prescriptions from the White House itself on this particular thing. But I don't know. I mean, I think it certainly was kind of publicly embarrassing for the Republicans in the House. It was probably aggravating for those in the Trump White House. But I don't think that it means that there's not a possible replacement coming.
Heidi, I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that my assumption is that you were glad that this failed.
I was just going to say, yes, right.
But how would you regard the significance of its failure?
It's really, really, really important for the 24 million people who would have lost their health insurance if it had passed. It would have been a real disaster. We would have had, 24 million people lose health insurance. The people who stayed on their health insurance, the estimates are that premiums would have gone up. The coverage would have been, even though premiums would have gone up, the coverage would have been worse. There's an estimate that deductibles and copays would have gone up by around $33 billion a year. And those kinds of premium increases, deductible increases, copay increases were required in order to get the big tax cut that went to largely people I hate saying the top 1% because it sounds too cliche, but it's actually true in this case, that the big tax cuts were the things that was where the spending that used to happen on, or that currently happens on ACA went to. So it was a sort of a that, again, I just feel like I may be saying this all night, but that classic, like, you are kind of siding with the already affluent in this bill, and so it was a good thing that it went down. There's talk. I just got a press release today that there's talk that there's going to be, even next week, more attempts to push it through. So I don't think we've seen the end of this. I'm not sure where it's going, but. And then I think there was the thing where Trump said, wow, policy, when he was in particular looking at the healthcare law, when he actually stood up at a press conference and said, turns out it's really complicated. Like, that is, I think that sort of kind of underscores where that the administration maybe didn't do their, like you said, didn't do their homework to get something that would, bring the factions within Congress together to agree on something.
I want to come back to that last point and reframe it a little bit in a few minutes, but let me try something different here. It goes back to the executive actions issue, and I want to try to broaden that. And Ryan, I'll bring this back to you, I guess. Are there, when you look at the way the administration has gone about its business, do you see a signaling of a fundamental change in the way that government works or is structured that would concern you? I mean, there has, for example, been a criticism that there's been an over-reliance on executive orders as a way to get things done. So when you look at this administration, do you see it trying to restructure in some way? Maybe that's where there's a strategy of actually the way Washington works.
I would have said after the election that would have been a concern of mine. I mean, this is a big town with established agencies and established practices where I think there are limits to what a president can do by design. And so I see in many ways this administration acting actually in some fairly conventional ways. I personally have a long-standing concern with the growth of the administrative state and an overly activist executive branch. I would prefer to see congressional powers strengthened to check that. And so, my concern was not whether it was President Obama and his famed "all I need is a pen and a phone." I had the same concern about President Trump with just a pen and a phone. And so, I think really, in many ways, he's doing things that come naturally to him. I've never heard Donald Trump as a candidate or as a president talk about federalism or the separation of powers. He discovered that healthcare is complicated, and probably will continue to discover that separation of powers is a limiting factor as well. So in terms of vaunted claims at the deconstruction of the administrative state and all of these things, I think it's actually quite challenging to do. I would rather see reforms kind of down Pennsylvania Avenue that limit some of that activity. So I don't see at this point any signs of a fundamental restructuring of the way government operates. And maybe I'm looking at it too simplistically, but once you start making appointments and people have to start governing, you actually have to rely on some fairly conventional procedures and practices to get that work done.
Heidi, do you want to comment on that? Because you had pointed out some things I think that you had thought were sort of big changes in the way that.
One of the things that is it's just very, very different with this administration is that in the appointments, what we're seeing is just people that have a profound lack of experience in leading the agencies that they're being charged to lead. So in some ways, that means that in itself is a big change. Like, these agencies are incredibly complicated. You need a huge amount of institutional knowledge to understand what they do and how to run an agency like that. Or any of the major agencies. So I don't actually know what that means. Does that mean that there'll be less change because they'll be so dependent on the career, they'll be less able to sort of drive changes because it will take a long time to figure out what's going on? It's a good question, but there is this I think it's pretty safe to say that we have the set of appointees right now are just hands down have the least amount of relevant experience for the agencies that they're running. And so that will it's a big change, and that will, many of them haven't actually started yet. Like, I will say this all the time, I have my eyes on the Department of Labor, and the Secretary of Labor hasn't been installed yet. So we'll sort of see how these things play out. But it's something that's very different.
So let me come back to the sentence that both of you referenced, that who knew, or it turns out it's complicated, and ask a little bit different question that plays off of that, and that's that one of the things that a lot of people were attracted to Trump as a candidate was this perception of, okay, here's a guy who just says what he thinks. It's relatively uncomplicated. It is authentic. There certainly was at least for the perception of a lot of folks, the big authenticity gap between the two candidates. And so, you see some of this too in a comment like that. I mean, the fact that, he'd say something like that. And certainly watching a press conference is a different kind of an experience from the Obama press conferences, which were, I think, fair to say, rather filibustered on his part, oftentimes. So do you think there's anything positive for the political system that comes out of this disorder and you say lack of a sense of what winning is and lack of a strategy? I mean, is there at least something that's positive for the way that people at least perceive their political system? Maybe I'm grasping for straws here, but.
I think he asked you. That's a hard question to answer.
I sort of was looking at you, Ryan. Okay. Actually, that's correct.
Well, I actually think that the way in which the elites of this country were characterized in the campaign And I don't just mean that in terms of the remarks and comments that Donald Trump said. I think particularly in the primaries when Bernie Sanders was gaining a lot of traction and attention, it really did sort of blow the lid off of this two Americas phenomenon that's been documented in social science research, has been written about in popular works, but then sort of came on full display in the political process. And the idea that people who do have experience and the people that do know what they're doing actually sometimes are part of the problem, or at least this perception in the heartland that people really connected well up and down the I-95 corridor seem to be collusively enriching themselves at the expense of the rest of us. And I actually did a short sojourn in Indiana when Mike Pence was running for governor as his policy advisor, and then when he got elected, and was amazed at how town hall after town hall you ran into kind of card-carrying, red meat Republican conservatives who had just as much anxiety and even anger about Wall Street as they did Washington, D.C. And this was a kind of a new thing that just what's good for business doesn't necessarily mean it's good for us here on Main Street. And so it kind of opened my eyes a little bit. I thought I was from the Midwest, my family's still there. I thought I understood what was going on. I was like, wow, I'm in the bubble too. You know, these folks are really exercised. And so I think the way in which we have seen what some of us who follow this stuff just in the data and the numbers, you kind of have seen played out in sort of a narrative fashion and a historical fashion, in kind of demographic reality, this growing sense that people who are in the know, people who are connected, whether it's through politics or through commerce or whatever, are having a pretty good post-2008 while the rest of us are not. And so I think that in some ways that's been good for the political process. In terms of what it means as for policy, I don't know. I mean, you could have a real reversal where your point is that the very people who have this anxiety are going to be let down, and that's possible. But I do think that it's healthy for a democracy to have these kind of explosions and fissures happen from time to time. And I actually think that the 2016 outcome was good for the Democratic Party. I think what you're seeing in town halls around the country, I think there's when political parties are kind of coming back to life or rediscovering themselves, sometimes it's messy and it's loud, and we've seen this in both the Republican and the Democratic parties over the last couple of cycles, and I think in general that's a good thing. I think it has raised this question, though, of middle American incomes and put them center in a way that they haven't before. I mean, this is a different Republican administration that way. Now, perhaps the policies that are chosen aren't going to do that. But you can't argue with the assertion that you have a Republican president who looks at policy options a bit differently for working class families. And so that could sort of even realign the party in some fundamental ways. A kind of large industrial policy and even infrastructure policy where you have a lot of healthy skepticism within the Republican Party, you could actually see people congealing around that in new ways. What I think is probably underlying some of these rule changes that you're talking about, though, is more an idea of what it takes to actually get employers to grow. That's one thing we haven't talked about tonight, is actually just growth and how you actually get more firms, more new firms, more job-creating firms created. And there's a sympathy that's very traditional, in this White House with that notion as well, but it's not clear exactly what the policy is. So which course they take and how that's received across the country by working families will do a lot to actually determine the answer to this question, if that makes sense.
Can I just say something to that? Because I think that is a really core thing that happened we had a guy who, Sanders actually did this too, but I cannot tell you how frustrating it was to me to hear Trump be so resonant with people pointing out the problems that I have spent my entire career trying to get people to understand. That we have an economy that really is, since it didn't used to be this way, things weren't perfect in the 50s and 60s. There were a lot of disparities, but one of the things that was right is that as the economy grew, as we got richer as a country, that increased income was really broadly shared. We saw rising living standards for low and middle income workers around about the 70s. That just basically stopped. We saw the country continued to get richer, but the wages, the incomes of low and middle income folks, it just kind of tapered off. And people feel that. Like, people know that's going on. They're looking at around what opportunities are available for them. And I think that was a huge misstep of the Obama administration. I was screaming from the inside of, we can't tell everyone that things are so great, because the median wage is $17.80. Like, that's what our economy is delivering for the American worker. We can't sort of, I mean, things are a ton better than they were in the complete we are all on fire period of the Great Recession. Like, there were lots of improvements. But in the last couple of years of the Obama administration, where I felt like there was an attempt to kind of take a victory lap, I was like, no, this does not feel like victory to the heart of the heart of the labor market, where the median wage is, less than $18 an hour. So I was always a little bit terrified of Trump. But there was some hope that his actual highlighting some of these issues and talking to people and getting those conversations out there, starting, like, there's more awareness of the problems than there was before. So that part was, I feel like that part's positive. Where he put the blame for that was a real problem, because he put it on immigrants. He put it on, like, what he was saying was the cause of those problems ended up taking a really ugly turn. And so I think that was, we really need to talk, this is a whole different conversation about what is leading to the rising inequality that we were seeing. But it is not our immigration policies. And so that sort of went to an ugly place, but highlighting the issues that middle America is feeling, that middle income workers are feeling, is really important.
So here's my last question, and we'll see what folks want to ask you. I want to ask each of you, Heidi, we'll start with you, to look into the future, not at the last 90 days, but at the next 1,000 days. And yeah, there's actually more than 1,000.
Okay. Is the wine out yet?
So he just said, is the wine out yet? Right.
And to ask each of you what do you think, Heidi, is going to be, in that time period, the most important policy change that we are going to see implemented? What will be the biggest policy change, most significant policy change that you think we'll see?
That's a fine question, because it feels like death by 1,000 cuts right now, so it's sort of hard to, and I wonder if, I'm not a foreign policy expert at all, I know not at all, but I wonder if, the sort of nuclear brinksmanship seems sort of concerning in that, but so I'll stick domestically, like, what could be the biggest, I mean, yeah, you know what? Maybe I'll just stick with. I mean, it would be a huge and very detrimental thing for our country if there was a dismantling of the Affordable Care Act. So that would be a big danger. I expect that we will see some sort of tax plan that will go through that will be, the Ryan plan, which is probably what would be the blueprint for a tax plan, is just huge tax cuts for the very wealthy, and tax cuts that are sort of in the Ryan plan. The Tax Policy Center showed that 3/4 of the benefits of that plan go to the top 1%, and even within the top 1%, the beneficiaries are at the very the 50% of the benefits of that tax plan go to the top 1/10 of 1%. So I think we can expect that we will see there will be a tax reform going through that really shifts income farther to the top. But and then I think we'll continue to see these sort of more hidden death by 1,000 cuts, undermining, dismantling laws and regulations that protect workers, that protect the environment, that protect consumers. I think that we'll be seeing this assault continue on all fronts.
Ryan, what are your thoughts on the one big change you think was the most significant change?
I don't know, but I think that the big challenge, and if I were in there and were advising them, what I would focus on would be how to fulfill these promises to quote unquote bring the jobs back. I mean, because that, again, an overly simplistic analysis of what has happened to our economy, not a recognition that a lot of these jobs have gone away for other reasons, automation and the like. But to have a consistent policy about what it's actually going to take to see more job growth in good middle class jobs is what I think they need to be focused on. I think you'll pay a political price for that in 4 years if they can't. So I think the tax plan would have to be understood in that way. It was interesting. You mentioned this executive order the other day, the Buy American one, which had two things in it. One was these procurement provisions. There's two laws, the Buy America and the Buy American laws, going back to 1933, 1978, which basically say, that the federal government needs to privilege American firms when it's buying goods and services. And this executive order said there are lots of loopholes, and so the agencies are directed to report on how not to go around the loopholes. And again, it could be ineffectual, maybe it could do some good. But the other part of it was to clean up the H-1B visa.
Yeah, that's good. Right.
And this was so that we stop awarding those very coveted 85,000 visas that are snatched up in 5 days every year to sort of outsourcing firms and not actually high-skilled foreign workers who actually would come to the country to start companies and these sorts of things. And I think that's where you see kind of these various kind of policy threads which must exist within the administration of sort of different objectives and goals. Where I thought when I first heard that there was going to be something on visas in there and there was going to be an immigration component, I thought, oh wow, this is going to be really interesting. I thought it was going to be a low-skill immigration sort of provision in this executive order, but they're basically saying let's get more highly skilled, highly trained people from overseas into this country. And I think there are these decisions that are made based on assumptions about economic policy that haven't been tied together in terms of the overall objective. I know it's a point I keep coming back to, but at the end of the day, all of these decisions that are sort of on the assumption that they're actually going to create new jobs through the creation of new firms, through more fast-growing firms and all of that, that's the narrative that we don't quite understand. Because even the way that executive order was framed and then the language of it were actually quite different, kind of to your point. So I don't know I can't predict over the next 1,000 days what's going to happen. But I think I can predict that if that commitment to people in towns that have lost manufacturing jobs, that have lost good middle class jobs, if he can't articulate what they're actually doing on that front in a way that instills confidence, I think that will change the landscape in 4 years.
So we've got, I think, 1 or 2 microphones that are going around. And we'll get this woman here first. I see Ben over here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question on healthcare.gov. They are projecting that I think it's Tennessee will have no providers, and there are several areas that will have 1 or 2. Now, that's not a free market that functions well, even, stretching it to the limit. And it seems to me that the closest thing they could do is I hate to say this, public option, where basically the Blue Crosses, for the most part, like Medicare, manage the claims and the government just supervises it.
Yeah, I think what you have just pointed out underscores that Obamacare isn't perfect. It needs a lot, there's a lot of, we put this thing in place, and if we had a Congress that was really working towards making sure we had a really high functioning healthcare system, there could be tweaks that we could figure out a public option or different ways to open things up so that we could, those gaps that we're seeing form, that we could help. So I think this, it's not it's better than what we had. It's not perfect. It would be great right now if we had people that were really dedicated to solving the problems about it that there are there, so we could sort of maintain its basic structure. And people could keep the care that they have, but it could be better.
Ryan, do you see Trump advocating a public option?
Haven't heard it. Complicated though, so maybe.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't see him advocating that. And really the problem that you're drawing attention to is in the whole kind of exchange side of this, right? Because when we talk about the ACA, it was a couple of things. It was expanding Medicaid, or giving states the option of expanding Medicaid eventually, up to 138% of poverty, and that's where a lot of when we talk about the coverage gains under the Affordable Care Act, that's where it happened, was in that part of it. The part that is most frustrating to most people is the exchange marketplace, where you're watching providers kind of run away, and that's where I think the attention, in particular on the various reform ideas that are competing, within Congress and in the discussions with the White House are on that particular side of things. And short of getting a more competitive marketplace with more options available to people in the insurance marketplace, where people have more choices that keep costs down. If you're not able to do that over the next couple of decades, there probably will be more of an appetite for what you're talking about.
The gentleman here had his hand up.
Hi, so both of you talked at the beginning a little bit about this idea that there's a communicational policy going on, right? That the first 100 days is a little bit more about approvals than real policy. So this idea that, workers' policies are being done under the table in silence, but the communicational strategy is by American, right? Or the mother of all bombs gets praises from different sides of the aisle. So that policy is not really focused on getting things done, but more about the approval ratings. But we see approval ratings actually going down the first couple of days of the Trump administration. So I want to take you a little bit towards the international route. So, we have these tensions around the world where we have the four big players: China, North Korea, Russia, and the US. The first three don't really have an opposition internally. The only one that has an opposition internally is the US. So could it be that Trump's strategic sort of communication ideas are to put forward policies that would turn the eyes to the outside world from the American people, for the American people, so that he could maintain approval ratings high and not really focus on what real solutions are? Obviously, this will come back, and in a year or two, the people start feeling the pain, and these policies don't work anymore. But in the first 100 days, this works for approval rating. So, going back to what Ryan was saying in terms of growth, a war economy brings growth, brings employment, right? Could this be something that you see happening, or do you see these policies that are being passed in silence sort of taking over, bringing growth before this is sort of an option?
I'll say, did you have something?
Go
I won't have that. I'll be quiet. I'll be short for once because I don't have a ton to say on this. It feels like there's not enough coordination and sort of having it all figured out yet to be sophisticated enough to be doing the sort of wag the dog thing. So it feels more like there's just sort of scattershot going on rather than a coordinated effort to get people to turn outward. But because there's kind of missteps happening domestically and in basically all arenas, that it's hard to think that for me to think that there's a real coordinated effort at that right now. I don't know if you have.
I wouldn't think that it was coordinated, but yeah. And I hope the lesson that we've learned from World War II is not that one. That we need
Yes.
Yeah, that the
Good
50s and
point.
60s were great, in part because we were the most productive, remaining economy, and I don't want to, that would be a terrible economic development strategy in my view. But there is I think a kind of two mindsets within a base of support that Trump does have that put him where he is, which sometimes can be held by the very same person, which is on the one hand, a more protectionist impulse because of exhaustion, because of wars overseas that have gone on for a long time without clear resolution. And so that is sort of rhetorically where Trump was as a candidate. It's where pretty much all the candidates were. But on the other hand, the view that when America is respected in the world, that's just a good thing. That national pride revolves around the idea that people take us seriously, and that people who love liberty, listen to America when it talks about that sort of a thing. And I think Trump probably does realize that when he acts decisively and does these things like he's done in his first 100 days on in foreign policy decisions, that it engenders a certain type of respect. But I'm sure that goes into the calculation. But I've always thought that when no matter what you think of someone's politics and who they are, if you know people in the national security community and you understand the kind of information that a president gets every morning, and the advisors around that president, what they get every morning, it's hard to believe that really anyone could just act flippantly for purely political motives. They're making decisions based on serious intelligence with all kinds of threats that's very real. And so I would not think that these would be purely politically calculated decisions, but whether they're based in an actual strategy and a theory of intervention is the thing. Like I was saying earlier, I don't think we've seen that yet.
We have Ben over here, and then this gentleman in the back's had his hand up for a while, and a woman up front. So we'll go here, here, and here, and we'll see how much time we have left after that. Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question about the work of governing. An example that comes up in the media today is Benghazi, and the fact that even though the president mentioned it many times throughout the campaign, he has not nominated someone for the role of Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security. And that's just one of a number of examples of Senate confirmable positions that have not been filled or even a nomination been identified. But at the same time, I've at least read that many of the positions that are not Senate confirmable have been filled rapidly. And so I'm trying to understand whether the Trump administration is telegraphing to us that it does not value or does not find important the roles of the Senate confirmable jobs. And also, I'd like to get a sense of where these people in the mid-level career, non-Senate confirmable positions, where are they coming from? Are they coming off the Hill? Are they coming from think tanks? Are they any good at their jobs? Or is this something that we should see more public outcry about?
So I haven't heard this, what I'm hearing from the agency that I get the report outs from all the time is the Department of Labor, and that's not the experience there. That the secretary, the Senate confirmed secretary will come, but we're not seeing, the assistant secretaries are also Senate confirmed, and those aren't being filled out. And wait, that's what you just said though. But then also that they're not seeing the next layer down of political appointments. At the Department of Labor, there are like 140 political appointees and a handful of Senate confirmed ones. And so there, as far as I know, they're not seeing that middle part. But it does kind of get back to this idea of we're getting people in place that don't have a lot of experience. I don't think there is a long list of people who are jumping in to join this administration. And so it's actually, I think, hard to find people, and it's this when you look at the budget, they cut non-defense spending by $54 billion. Like there's this huge cut in non-defense spending, and that budget there's zero likelihood it will actually go through, but the budget that Trump wanted would have cut the Department of Labor, would have cut the EPA, would have cut the State Department, would have cut the Health and Human Services Department. The proposals for the Department of Labor was to cut it by more than 20%. And so they don't, if that's what you're going for, it could just be that your view of sort of delivering a well-functioning government to the American people is sort of cutting it back as much as possible. It seems all of those lack of filling the positions is sort of consistent with the budget proposals.
I actually just have a very simplistic kind of practical view of the situation. I think that the administration was really behind the curve on the transition. You had a different transition team in there supposedly doing this work before they came in. So the responsibility for managing this transition got shifted from Chris Christie to Vice President Pence at a time very shortly after an election where maybe 5 people on that campaign thought they were going to win. And so in terms of the pre-war, I mean, there was obviously this transition work that was supposedly going on, but it was not nearly as far as previous administrations have been. And so then you add to that the size of the campaign was very different. Typically these Schedule C jobs, you're talking about the non-Senate confirmed ones that are filled with political appointees, people that have been active in the campaign and played some role will often be likely candidates to put forward there. So they've been finding these people from all around in other places. But they've also taken their vetting seriously, and they want, I think, and I'm looking at this through observation, just from what I've heard around town, they want people in these Senate confirmed jobs that were supportive of the candidate, or for the most part, not all of them. You have some people in there who were in the Never Trump crowd, but generally they're trying to get people in there that they find to be loyalists, and I think that's provided a supply problem. That was my
You want to do
comment.
it? Okay.
Okay.
We'll go to the next one. This-
Okay.
this gentleman right here.
Got a different question. It looked like they were in turmoil in domestic policy and international. Now it looks like he's taking a focus one way. The question we have where I'm working in water cooler is, who's that inner circle giving him the real information? Because he was tweeting, stopped tweeting. And now he's making deliberative decisions in places, not a lot on the domestic side moving, but on both sides. And we're just wondering, do you have any idea who in the inner circle is making, because these look like real informed decisions. I mean, tomahawks to Syria is not a light decision, and that was made by national security, real people on the inside. But who is doing that? Because originally it was a shakeup, but now there's obviously people close who've got the real knowledge, whether they're Heritage, Enterprise, Brookings folks close in there. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on who those people are.
Does anybody here work for the White House? I think we're all kind of on the outside looking in, trying to figure that out. I do think it's the case that the senior team that you do see in the photographs and all of that, they are with the president a lot. Their policy process doesn't. Their policy process does, in fact, involve a collection of senior advisors, kind of all of the time. So I don't exactly know if there's any one person that you can point to that answers that question, but I think the collection of advice that he's getting from the vice president, from his chief of staff, from his son-in-law, and from his military advisors, particularly on these issues of foreign policy, it appears that he's actually listening to that counsel. But I think I've seen these, I've seen people debate in the media kind of who has the most influence and who has, and I think if there's anything you can kind of piece together is that the moment you think that someone has the most influence, the next day you'll find out that they don't. And I think the president actually pays attention to those comments in the press.
I'm good. Nothing to add. I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, time for 2 more questions. And we'll get that gentleman there. Sorry. We'll
All right.
talk after.
So my question is a little bit more, we've been talking a lot about economics and disparities, and I wanted to ask the 2 of you about sort of the generational disparity in that for young people, we're seeing really high debt for education. Sorry, Syracuse. We're seeing our young people are not saving for retirement in the numbers they should be in order to be prepared. And I don't have a lot of stock in our long-term solvency of Social Security. I know President Trump has said that he wants to protect it in terms of balancing the budget, but I haven't heard a lot of conversation about reforms and seeing that on the healthcare side, there's more push towards health savings accounts. I just question whether our younger generation will be able to do that and be able to plan for it. And I just wanted to get your opinion on what needs to be done, and is Trump going to take us anywhere down that road?
You can go.
That's a great question, and I'm probably most disappointed that there's been absolutely no discussion from this administration about this particular issue. My colleague Jonah Goldberg had a column right around the time of the budget, which I really liked. He talked about the ritual of the budget rollout, where we have the budget document, and you've got people out briefing on it, and it lays out all the points, and it's all this fanfare, and we're really talking about this decreasing pie slice in the overall federal chart. There's this looming entitlement problem, which as a candidate, Trump never said anything about it. As a president, he seems to have made it clear he doesn't even want to go there. And I think we're at the point as a country where it's just civic irresponsibility not to have a plan about what to do with our looming entitlement programs. My kids are talking about it now. My teenagers, they actually know about this issue. This isn't just a wonky thing anymore. The AARP is its own zip code in Washington, D.C., and there's no equivalent for us, these comments that I hear. And no, not all AARP members, this is not a critique of the AARP. I'm just saying that when it comes to the interests of a younger generation who are concerned about these very things, that they're now paying for people who are older than them, but with very little guarantee that same thing's going to be there. And so I think we've had some successful steps in that direction. I was always a big fan of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. I thought that was one of the better commissions that have ever been stood up in the last 20 years or so. And I felt like we got close there, and after that there was kind of inaction after that as a national conversation. And by that I mean not just a national conversation that we're having in kind of vague terms, but in terms of people actually thinking about this on Capitol Hill and pulling in people together. I feel like we're going backwards, quite frankly. So I'm concerned about that.
I'll say a couple of things on that. I totally agree. We need to fix Social Security. There isn't actually a very easy fix to Social Security. One of the reasons that the trust fund is getting depleted is because there's a cap above which people don't pay Social Security taxes. And when that cap was set, people didn't expect the massive increase in inequality that we have seen. They did not expect that such a huge amount of the total income earned in this country would be earned by people earning above that cap. So they expected that cap would be grabbing more people and a bigger share of the earnings. So instead, we have this massive increase in inequality. A ton of the income is being earned above that cap, so we're not getting the taxes that we should. If we can solve the Social Security trust fund problem with not that big of a change to if we increase that cap, we can increase taxes a little bit. We definitely don't want to go down the road of cutting those benefits, because they have become more and more and more important to retirement savers, because we know that the shift from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, in that shift, it ended up that employers are just providing a lot less to workers. And so that leg of everyone talks about the legs of the retirement stool are Social Security, they're your employer provided pension or 401k, and then your private savings. People don't have private savings. Employer provided pensions are a lot less generous than they used to be. We cannot afford to not shore up Social Security, and we could do it with pretty easy fixes. And so I think that's sometimes when the Social Security question comes up, it feels like it becomes a generational fight, like young people versus older retirees who are drawing down their Social Security. And I think those are the wrong adversaries. We need to see what caused this sort of gap in the system, which a huge contributor to it was rising inequality. It's not it's not old people stealing all your stuff, right? It's the sort of the villains in this story. That's not who it is. Like we need to to address it. But it absolutely is an issue, and we absolutely should be addressing it. But I am deeply happy that it does not seem that the president is interested in cutting benefits. So that's actually, I hope he sticks to that.
I promise this gentleman the last question. So a very quick question and 2 very quick answers, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I know I'm very mindful of everyone sitting here and then sitting in the office for 8 hours before, but I can't let this panel go from Labor Department and our presidency and not having mentioned the automation. I mean, we're talking about jobs, and we're talking about these people left in Middle America, and we're talking about H-1B visas, and we're talking about innovation. And a lot of that innovation is linked to automating the jobs that we're trying to create. And the Trump presidency is as much symptom of the decline that you've mentioned that's been happening since the 70s as much as a cause of it, or maybe not. But just what do you think in automation and the future of the jobs that we're trying to create here?
I have a lot to say on this,
Minute
but I
or
will.
minute or less. 1 minute or less.
Okay, I'm going to keep it. So one of the things that people talk, the sort of impending robot apocalypse, they're going to take all our jobs. I was listening to somebody from NASA give a talk once about talking about a zero labor society. So we are so far from even getting close to anything approaching that. And there's a measure in that sort of economic data that really kind of gets at how much robots or other forms of automation are actually displacing workers. It's called productivity growth, which it measures the total amount of goods and services produced per human hour worked. And so as productivity growth rises, that could mean, like other things are producing stuff, not human hour worked. So just think of that when you hear about it in the news. Productivity growth is the thing that sort of is the baseline measure that tells how much robots are taking over our labor market. And if you look at the background information is that productivity growth has been growing since we started measuring this thing at the sort of shortly after World War II. We've seen increases in automation and technology and sort of innovations in how work gets done forever. We are seeing it now, but actually at a surprisingly low rate. If robots were taking over, we would see accelerating productivity. Instead, for the last 10 years, productivity growth has been unbelievably slow. So you'll hear one conversation where people are worried about robots taking over the world, and then you'll hear another conversation of economists saying, why is productivity growth so weak? What's going on? Why aren't we having the innovation that leads to the burst in productivity growth and all good things for our economy? And those things, they can't both be happening. They are not existing together. So there's this, I think, but when you look at the data, they really do show productivity is still growing, but at actually a slower rate than the rate we'd seen for decades that the economy can totally absorb. And rising productivity growth is actually what is needed in order to see rising living standards over time. So those kinds of improvements are how we see rising living standards. So it's of all of the gajillion things I am actually totally freaked out about our labor market, this is the last on the list.
Short answer, don't worry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm for what she said. Yeah. I'm more optimistic about this than the futurists are leading us to believe right now. And the only thing I would add on to that is that I think the reality of lots of jobs being unfilled every month is an indicator that the skills mismatch is actually a real thing. And so while we're waiting for the robots to take over all of our jobs, I think we actually need to see a lot more innovation in the career education space. And I think that's actually, if Trump wants to bring the jobs back, that's actually where they should be investing, I think, personally, right now. And I don't know that how much thinking is going into that. But this is where getting skills that we now have firms that are being able to kind of monetize. When you layer on a credential to whatever credential you have, you can actually earn X amount of dollars more. Some states are starting to play with this data and this forecasting data and making decisions about training based on that data. It's fairly new, and it's only happening in a few places, but I think that's where the innovation is going to come from. It's going to come through as a matter of state policy. I don't know how much we'll figure it out here in this town. But I think that skills mismatch is a real thing, and I think we need to be redoubling our efforts everywhere to address it.
So I got to grab that back from you. So just by way of conclusion, I want to go back to Dave's introduction. He mentioned the Athenian Oath. One of the other things that we value at the Maxwell School and we strive for is to create spaces for creative agreement and creative disagreement. And Heidi Shearholtz and Ryan Streeter, you really put that on display here for us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.